Hi, so I'm Lisa Anderson with LMA Consulting Group, and I'm here with John Tulac, an international business attorney. And we are going to talk a bit about what's going on in the world and what's going on in supply chain and some of the latest trends that are happening in supply chain as a part of our future proofing your manufacturing operations and extended supply chain series. So with that said, I'm going to turn it to John to talk a bit about supply chain, and we're going to have an interactive discussion.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lisa. Happy to be back with you again. We talked a lot about China last time, and I think we have to at least lead off with China again this time because China is always in the news, not so much with good news very much lately. But one bit of good news that we can start with is that China and the United States did sign the most recent addition to our list of trade agreements. It is face-saving for both countries. It is a Band-Aid. It doesn't address the most serious issues that we have with China, particularly with respect to its consistent failure to protect intellectual property, which, to be fair, they don't protect their own intellectual property very well inside China for themselves either. But the treaty does give, or the trade agreement, I should say, does give a pause to the economic hostilities on several fronts. So I think that's a good thing. And I think that it probably doesn't immediately present any new challenges on the supply chain side about anything coming out of China, but the Chinese are going to buy $200 billion more of our soybeans and other agricultural products in the next couple of years. And they're going to buy more of our goods. They're going to eventually open up the financial sector to outside money more. So I would think in terms of outgoing, there's some supply challenges for you to be thinking about with your clients. The second thing, of course, this is the bad news. There's always bad news when we're dealing with China today, but the latest addition to China's new cybersecurity laws is the blandly named Multi-Level Protection Scheme 2.0. And what this is, in my opinion, a serious game changer, but not in a good way. It went into effect December 1, 2019. It continues and enlarges on some trends that have already been part of China's regulation of data and cyber laws, the internet, cybersecurity, and so on. And then add several new things. One is all data that goes in and out of China, all data in China must be kept on Chinese servers. Now, what that means in a nutshell is that anybody's data in China is subject to inspection and seizure by the Chinese government at any time. There's no Chinese server farm operator that's going to say, oh no, we have protected data in here, there's privacy. There is no privacy in China with respect to data, period, in my view. Which means that for the back and forth communications that someone would have with your Chinese counterpart that might involve intellectual property, it's wide open for the government to take anytime it wants. Every new cell phone that's issued now in China can only be issued, I shouldn't say cell phone, but cell phone number, requires a facial scan for whoever gets the number. So that would also apply to foreigners. You want to have a local cell phone in China, your mug shot is going to be part of the Chinese database. Lovely.
Wow.
And the surveillance in China in terms of what they just routinely spy on the streets. There are more cameras on the streets of China than anywhere else in the world combined.
Wow,
so
that's amazing.
And the Chinese people have accepted this, not like they have a lot of choice, but it's a trade-off. I'm getting some economic security, economic advancement, and if this is the cost, then most Chinese are willing to pay it.
Well,
So,
so
so that's, I mean, there's so many other layers to this, but just that alone ought to cast a shadow on future relations with the Chinese companies that may be part of our supply chain.
yeah, absolutely. So I guess let's go to part two first, and then I'll come back to part one, just because part two is so concerning. So when you say that, so are you saying anyone that certainly any Chinese-owned company is going to have to live by these data rules, but it also sounds like anybody who has manufacturing operations in China would have to have their data stored there. But also, if you have a supplier in China, will it impact any of those three scenarios?
I think so, because your Chinese counterparts are going to be receiving information from you. It's going to come through Chinese networks. It's going to come into the Chinese company's system. Those messages and anything else that comes out of it will be embodied in other communications. Those things are going to get stored. They have to be stored inside China. So all of it's accessible.
So I guess if we're so to your point, anyone that's a Chinese, you know, if a Chinese company is doing it, your data is going to be there. If your supplier is in China, the problem here is that you have to send designs or some other way for it to be produced. And what you're saying is that that will be accessible. A lot of my clients have like access to their systems where they want their suppliers to be able to input data into the systems. And if that means you're subjecting your entire system, your entire ERP system to scrutiny in China, I imagine that none of my clients are going to want to do that. But it sounds like that would be true.
Yeah, anything that's over here technically isn't subject to this. It's only if it flows across the borders to China that it then is something that can be picked up and it's going to get stored there to the extent that Chinese company has to have it to use it, and it's going to be stored somewhere, and that somewhere is inside of China.
Well, so like, if they're on like SAP or something, one of the systems, the server is here and everything is here. However, somebody in China is entering manufacturing data, quality data, some other data into the system. It means that they have to have access to the system there. So are you saying that in that case, the letter of the law is that it wouldn't necessarily be that they would gain access? Certainly if there's a security protocol in place, they would only have access to where they're entering data, I guess. But is that pretty much what you're saying? However, you're sending other data to them and that can be accessed by anyone.
Right. So let's assume that they're inputting data in China and they're sending it, and that they don't intend to keep it inside China, they destroy it. Nevertheless, it's going to flow through Chinese-based servers to exit China. Yeah. And so theoretically, it's capable of being captured.
Yeah, I get it.
At any point along the way. And there's certainly nothing in the law in China that would prevent the government from doing that. And even if there was a law, the government could come up with any kind of pretense it wants to intercept data. Right. The second thing is, and this has already happened, so this is really scary. Certainly the Chinese cyber experts are among the world's finest, and China actually spends good money on hiring the best and brightest hackers to hack for the government. Now, of course, that's totally denied, but we even know where some of them work. We know what building in Beijing houses some of the top hackers in the world. Now, they're not just playing games. And so every time something moves to the United States from China, you have the potential that it could carry something malicious along with it, or something that could harm a system here, or just spyware. Right. And there's already Chinese spyware that impacts a lot of American companies. If they have a bank account with a Chinese bank, they need a key. and they don't get access without the key. And the key is given in the form, I think the term is a dongle. So it's a little device you have to plug in to a USB port. And basically that lets the government spy on everything that you're doing relative to your banking.
Well, and in what situations do you have to have banking in China? If you just have a supplier in China, do you have to?
Yeah, if you don't, but if you are physically in China, if you have a joint venture, you have people there, you're gonna have bank accounts there.
Got it.
And so if you decide I'm going to open a bank account with Bank of China in New York, just because you're doing so much business with China, they're going to issue you a key.
Yes.
They're required to, not under U.S. law, but because they're Bank of China.
Right. I see. All right. So really what you're saying is this is really quite concerning for supply chain in general. Is that we'll come back to the trade agreement later, but right now things have gotten exponentially worse as of December when this law went into effect, because in essence, anything that you send to and from China is for all eyes to see in China. So there are no secrets there, no IP. I mean, basically, you don't know where it could end up, which could be very bad.
Right. In my opinion, you have no expectation of privacy of data with anything that you flow to China or which flows from China to you.
Yeah, that's really worrisome.
How do you manage that?
I have to say, so you basically certainly I don't think a lot of clients that have a supply, like have a source of supply in China, are really aware of or understanding this law and what that means. But I'm certainly going to be sending this webinar to all of them. But basically, they should be very concerned. And really, what can you do about it, though? There's nothing you can do about it in China. It really means you have to be looking elsewhere, isn't that? I mean, pretty much there's no other options if you're concerned about your data getting out.
If you have intellectual property to protect, especially if it's in the form of a trade secret, and you're sharing that information, even though it's on a need-to-know basis, and you've got contracts in place and you trust your Chinese manufacturing counterpart, you're still exposing your IP now, as far as I can tell, to the government when it decides it wants to look at your communications. It's, this looks pretty good.
Yeah, right.
So if you have that kind of especially sensitive IP,
right.
Or I would think if you have IP that's subject to ITAR, I don't think you can do business with the Chinese.
Yeah, I don't think ITAR, because like I work with several clients that use ITAR, and I don't think you could do that. You couldn't do that. You couldn't handle. At least from what you're describing, ITAR is a no-go. However, I also think, to your point, any clients that have would be concerned about the Chinese stealing their designs or knocking them off. That would be an issue. Then they really need to think twice, because that's gonna happen. And now, to some degree, that happens anyway, right? But basically, what you're saying is that it's open. It's now like perfectly legal to do all of these things, in essence, because the data is going to be out there for whoever wants it. So I think, really, unless you have a product that you're not concerned about the IP or trade secret with, you really need to be looking and moving quickly for at least a backup supply, if not transitioning your supply base. But that's going to create some havoc from a supply chain point of view if everyone wants to do that.
I would think so, and I would think there, it becomes a matter of how do you manage something like this. The transition time, I think, would be very, very difficult.
Right. Well, I do have a client that is transitioning. It was because of cost reasons, and they were ahead of the tariffs. So a proactive client, which is awesome. But really, they're running into transition challenges, which is very typical, and it's just because a significant portion of the volume was in China and is being transferred out, and they still have good relationships with the folks in China as well as where they're sending it to in Vietnam. And so really, it's the best of situations, but once this catches on, if they were competing with a bunch of other people, regardless if it's in their industry, if they're competing with a bunch of other people in terms of transitioning, finding new suppliers, it's just going to get harder and harder to keep supply going while you're also transitioning. And, it's going to add expense as well.
I would think that at least in the interim, it would be necessary to try and encrypt as well as possible things, maybe use codes, private code system. I'm really trying to reach here because I don't expect that we can have any help from the government. I don't expect this to be widely reported in the popular media because how disruptive it is to the major companies that are so entrenched in China with no ability to overcome that inertia in any reasonable.
That's horrifying. I mean, to your point, because there are major companies entrenched in China. And you're right. I don't expect this is going to be a widespread in terms of news because it could create panic. So the good news here is that those of you that are associated with John Tulac and LMA Consulting and Lisa Anderson can get ahead of the game. And believe me, you want to, because if you're being proactive on this topic, you're going to be ahead of the mass crowds, because something is bound to happen here sooner versus later as folks decide what they want to do with this new this new data law, shall we say.
I think one of the other things where this, I think, for a smaller to medium-sized company that's willing to be nimble and quick and act on this, with a plan B, exiting China in a reasonable timetable, orderly fashion, not just, not making any waves about it, just quietly going about it, will give a real advantage over competition that stays in China. It may take 2-3 years even for that to be realized, but I think that will happen. The other thing, at least in the short term, that occurs to me is, we forget that once upon a time, before we had all this technology to help us, we did some nice old-fashioned things like we sent couriers with blueprints and drawings and paper to our counterparts overseas and delivered them. Well,
that's a very interesting idea. I mean, that wouldn't be a bad idea for especially sensitive information, as an interim solution, while also pursuing a backup supply. And great idea. I like that idea, because you should do something to protect yourself, because this, especially as a small or medium-sized manufacturer, you could be, have many unintended consequences. So I think that's a great idea. Consider the old days when the data protection laws did not have to apply to computers, and be like my client that was proactive in finding additional sources of supply, at least a minimum of a backup supply. But I don't even think that's sufficient. That's step one. A minimum is going to be that you start transitioning supply out of China, and you think through your company strategy and figure out what it is that you can live with and what you can, knowing that your data can be seen by anyone. And then if you can live with that, fine, but at least you have a backup plan and you're going into it well informed.
Exactly. And I think that probably this message is better delivered and will be better received, heard, and understood and acted on if the sounding of the alarm comes more from business consultants than from lawyers.
Yes, that is true.
You're the ones that are working, especially with kinds of things that you do, Lisa, with the clients on sometimes literally a daily basis. keeping their supply chain running.
Right.
And so you're saying, here's a serious potential problem and we need to do something about it right now. And you're already in place to do that, as opposed to, you know, a legal opinion on this is not much more than you're in potentially a heap of trouble.
Right. Now go to sleep for the night. No, you're absolutely right. So one of the purposes of this webinar, future-proofing your supply chain. You should jump into action. If you have any interactions with China, you must get quickly informed and start jumping into action, at least in terms of future-proofing your ability to function as a company. And that's going to require that you get a better understanding of how you should maneuver this situation. And, you know, by all means, I hope that you are already pursuing multiple sources of supply and don't have a sole source situation occurring. So from that point of view, John, let's say that now we've sufficiently scared everyone to death. How does the good news is, of the trade agreement is that, like you said, we've calmed down the tariff war, if you will, and we have a first phase solution to it. Now, I understood there was something written in there about IP. So there's something more than nothing related to IP. Of course, there is this data problem on the back end. But what is it about IP that was written into that? Or is it, even a phase one, I guess, is better than no phase, but tell us about
it. The most important thing, in my view, is that we need China to clean up its act with respect to IP in particular. But that's not the only bad set of business practices in terms of basically not following international norms, customs, and practices. They have violated a lot of what they pledged to do when they joined WTO. So all of that's been kicked down the road. Right. So the only thing that really is kind of more implied rather than clearly stated in this about IP is that it's recognized as a major issue, and that was kicked down the road.
I see. Well, I guess the good news there is that you have to start by recognizing the fact that it's an issue. So I think, it's actually written somewhere is a start, but to your point, it's by no means addressed.
Exactly. And we win this battle in the long term. The question is just how long is the long term? China actually has, believe it or not, good laws about protection of intellectual property. When you read them, you look at it and say, this is reasonable. This is a good scheme. When Mao and his gang of merry communists took over China, they did not abrogate any of the treaties that China was a party to, and China was a party to the main treaties affecting intellectual property, some of which had been in force in effect for quite a number of years. They just, like the Russians, under Soviet rule, never followed them.
Right.
So the framework from a legal standpoint is in place.
Okay, well, that's good.
So that's a good thing. The other thing is that Chinese companies, and we talked a little bit about this the last time we got together, Chinese companies are developing more and more of their own IP that is world-class. And so they want the protection. They need it as much as any other company does. And so the combination of things is such that ultimately they have to join the rest of the world, and at least the rest of the world that plays by the rules with respect to intellectual property, which is most of the rest of the world.
So I guess the good news there is that they, it sounds like, this first step could be carried forward, and more steps have to come because they don't want to. They don't want a mass exodus. They want to thrive, and they have to thrive because they have a ton of people to support. So it sounds like you're saying from an IP point of view, by no means are we, we're like a baby step forward here. But it seems like positive that we can continue to move in that direction. I think what begs the question to me though is, do you think that they'll reverse the data law? Because once people find out about it, don't you think that there's going to be like a mass uproar with especially some of the large companies as well, and they won't want to lose all those companies?
I think that's a good question. And I think that at the end of it all, China is going to be faced with a real conflict. On the one hand, the Chinese party, the Communist Party, rather, and the government, which is controlled by the party, wants this iron grip control over everything. On the other hand, they're very pragmatic. Mm-hmm. And if this sets off the alarm bells such that they're not going to do this, they're going to lose business, or they are going to lose business en masse, they're going to have to do something about it. And of course, the face-saving way is to simply point to the title to start with and say, you are misunderstanding. This is not what this means. This is not what we do. And even if we gave ourselves the right to do it, we would never think of doing it.
Right.
Parentheses, without compelling good reason, close parentheses.
Right.
So stop overreacting, people. We're just good capitalists here.
I'm sure that would be a start to what they would say. However, there wouldn't be protection.
No, but it would be then, to what extent are they actually using this law against foreign companies to gain access to stuff that's none of their business?
Right.
And so the more, and of course, we're not necessarily going to know when they do that either.
Well, right. We'd have to have our own hackers or something to figure it out, I guess. That's the challenge. So, yeah, well, I guess that's going to be the question in my mind is there'll be a point, I think, where they'll have to revise, because they don't want to lose all the business they have in China today. And it's actually not even practical. That's the downside here. That's why our clients need to be reacting quicker than the general public, because there's no way that any countries can absorb all the business in China anytime soon. So that's going to be a challenge, to be sure.
Right. And if you're just making widgets, this doesn't have that kind of chilling effect that it would on somebody with really serious,
like a high-tech product
protected by trade secret only, no patents, nothing else visible. You don't have to be Coca-Cola to have something that's really, really valuable, but it's not in one vault and only 2 people in the world know about it. It's
right. Although I've had several clients that have like the magic recipe or whatever you want to call it, and it doesn't have to be food related, where they that would be a severe issue. And I guess for the rest, like you said, somebody who's making widgets that are more commodity like, they're more concerned about the IP aspects, somebody stealing it, I guess, than anything else. But they probably have to suspect that could be happening anyway, so they should be prudent. But it would be less of a risk than the high-tech person that really has some trade secret.
Yeah, I mean, the more fungible you are, the less of a concern this is from a business standpoint. You may still not like it from a freedom perspective, a privacy perspective. But
no clients will like it from a freedom point of view. Now, a lot of I hear lots of Chinese companies are actually doing more and more manufacturing in Vietnam. So that's aside from the point of like one of my clients left China and is manufacturing direct in Vietnam. So the good news about that is I'm assuming that China can't affect Vietnam's laws if you're doing it direct. But if the Chinese company you're sourcing through is actually manufacturing in Vietnam, my guess is that the law still applies because China is the one directing it.
Right, and that information is then flowing into and out of China, going through the Chinese servers. So I think
So go direct.
It's open to exposure.
If you're
And
gonna,
the other thing is that China, at least business people are trying to make a go of it in Vietnam, but they're not always well received there because there's still real hostility between Vietnam and China
yeah,
over a multitude of issues. So
yeah, I hear that. It's interesting because there's a lot of manufacturing that is being done in Vietnam by Chinese, but there, like you said, that's an interesting dynamic. I understand.
yeah,
So
so I wouldn't want to do it that way. I think a U.S. company would be better off going to Vietnam and doing it directly.
yeah, and actually from that point of view, if you're considering your sourcing options, I absolutely concur with John. Look at going direct because not only will it cost you less, but you won't have to worry about this data protection law. But the Vietnamese really enjoy doing business with the U.S. and they're very interested in manufacturing. And there are certainly the infrastructure is not to the same point as it is in China, but they certainly are, investing and putting a lot of effort into manufacturing in Vietnam. So it's something to consider. It's of course not the only option, but it's just a growing option. Would you agree with that, John? Or
Yes, and it's true for all of the growing economies in Southeast Asia. So you're looking at Thailand, you're looking at Cambodia even has had
okay.
some successes in recent years. India is still somewhat of a somnolent giant. It should have been a lot further along than it is now, but there's this incredible potential for business with India. Indonesia is, everybody forgets how big Indonesia is because we look in the map, we see a bunch of scattered islands. It doesn't look that big, but India is a big country with a lot of population and a fairly strong business climate.
So Indonesia, I mean, actually, I'm glad you're bringing these up. So to give folks some ideas of going to research, there's Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, India, which we might even address separately because it is a challenge yet a vast opportunity. It sounds like. What other countries over there would you think of if you have products that are more commodity like that you would probably not bring back to the U.S. because it has a high labor component that you would want to look at? Are there other ones that jump out at you?
Malaysia.
Malaysia, okay, that's right. You mentioned that.
Each of these countries has some real strengths, but their infrastructure is nowhere near as advanced as what China has been able to create for manufacturing.
Right.
So you will find that there might be some frustrations. Myanmar is another country that is trying now to catch up. And if you're willing to accept the risks associated with an economy that is not as far advanced, and you're looking at the long run, you're looking at something that isn't so high tech.
Yeah.
That's one of your cheapest options.
That's a good thing to know.
So there's always somewhere else to look besides China.
Right. Right.
It's a matter of thinking like folks were doing back in the early 80s to late 80s. In the early 80s, you were a real pioneer.
Right.
And what you could do in China was fairly limited. But then
it's amazing.
It kept growing. So if you were one of the early ones in, you really became entrenched. And so I think the same opportunity is there in some of these other countries.
Well, I think there's something to consider. If you have a high labor cost content product, listen to what John's saying. Look at some of these other countries, and actually, you brought up India as well. I have a client that's actually moving manufacturing to India, and like you said, there's definitely challenges. Certainly, getting product from facilities to even like a port is a challenge there, right? They do have. They are building upon the capacities, and it sounds like from what you're saying that if they could get their infrastructure under control, which they certainly wish to do, they could be a force. Sounds like.
I think so.
So yeah, so definitely take a look at those. And that brings me to other options aside from Asia, because as you're reevaluating, it might be time to rethink your complete strategy here. So one of the other things that when you're future proofing your supply chain is to be thinking about where are your customers. So if your customers are around the world, what I'm finding, the most successful clients have manufacturing around the world. What I mean is that you want to near source manufacturing close to your customers, because customers are expecting more and more. They're expecting rapid deliveries, rapid customizations, and rapid response across the board, from new product development through delivery. And so if you can locate the manufacturing arm of this close to them, then you at least eliminate the what is oftentimes for I have several clients that have products coming from Asia, and I would say a 3 month average, 2 to 3 months. It depends on where it's going, depends on a lot of factors, but typically speaking, more than 2 months and closer to three is what you have to add into the equation for it to be manufactured overseas, because there's just time commitments required, and the working capital requirements for 3 months of inventory tied up, or 3 months of you know disruptions that could happen aside from what we're talking about in terms of data protection, just all sorts of things that can happen along the way, in terms of who knows, natural disasters, political issues, conflicts, all sorts of things. So you should be thinking about that. So from that point of view, we're near sourcing. So if you have most of your business in North America, first of all, I would say that you should be considering export, because that is a vast opportunity. But maybe that's a subject for another webinar, because we could probably talk about that for sure for an hour. With that said, though, you should be definitely thinking, and maybe we should do that, John. But with that said, I think you should be thinking about producing closer to your customer base. And with that said, what about our new agreement with Canada and Mexico, John?
So the Senate passed that with very little in the way of rancor. So here was an example where they managed to cross the aisles and shake hands and vote on this. I think the vote was 89-10 to approve, which I think was really good evidence that they are capable of doing some things together. So I would take that as a very good positive thing. Yep. But yeah, in the real short term, this doesn't mean much. In the long term, it really becomes a matter of political will, I think, because business people have already figured out how to do business with Canada and with Mexico. The changes to the NAFTA, which was an extraordinarily successful and effective trade agreement, were phenomenal. And now we're going to build on that.
Right.
But we have to manage the politics. And so the new agreement, at least in the short term, doesn't really change how everybody's going to do business. But as we look ahead to what the new agreement allows for expansion, for repurposing, rethinking some ways of doing things and so on, there's opportunity there. And it makes so much sense when you say, put your production where your customers are. Well, for most US companies, their primary customers are in North America, primarily in the United States. But we forget that Canada and Mexico are our two biggest trading partners, and they have pretty good economies, and so they want our goods too.
Right.
So the opportunity to export is there. And then for a little bit of planning and thinking, and there's a whole lot of good infrastructure support, you say, you know what, we can have our goods made in Mexico. world-class labor force. The labor rates are higher than they used to be, but they're still lower than the United States. And you put a Mexican component on an American brand, and you be not just only a good neighbor, you become a good citizen with your local presence inside Mexico. There's a potential there for really, really explosive growth for a lot of U.S. companies by being in Mexico.
Well, and that there could be an argument. There could be an argument here for really having facilities in both Mexico and the U.S. And it depends again on what kind of products you're talking about. But Mexico and Canada can provide a good option where you can largely get there much quicker, and you can expedite things. To your point, the infrastructure is there. I know that you have mentioned on a prior webinar, or at least in prior conversations, that the leadership in Mexico is not so friendly to business exactly. However, it sounds like you feel like that could still be navigated because like it's already in place, or am I reading too much into your statements?
I think it can be navigated. I don't think that if you're in the oil patch or energy, any part of the energy sector, you're going to get a warm welcome right now, despite the fact that Mexico desperately needs not only the expertise, but the financial investment. But we're not getting that from the Obrador administration. So other things, however, particularly if you were to locate in some of the cities that are embracing more manufacturing and providing incentives, I do think that's a big opportunity, and nobody's going to mess with you. The government's not going to interfere with that. So if you're in almost every other sector, you've got a good chance of going down there and becoming a presence that you can really build on. And then you can also use that production to bring those goods back into the United States.
Right, so, right. Because the one thing that, to your point, NAFTA has been a successful agreement. The new agreement between the United States and Mexico and Canada, builds upon that, and it does add some good steps to it that'll improve things over the long term. So that's a good thing. But really, what you're saying is that it's well worth looking at Mexico and Canada really as well, especially to build upon the demand in those countries, in addition to supplying the U.S. depending on the type of product and your strategy.
What kind of feedback are you getting from your clients about doing business with or in Mexico?
Well, a lot of them are. I mean, they're basically, things, generally speaking, this doesn't relate to the administration, but they're generally speaking, it's a little like slower or a little less organized, if you will. So you have to be more on top of things, and you do have to build in some lead time. So that's where I say, if you have quick delivery type products and you want things done quickly, you might want to have both, right? Or you may make your lower cost products in Mexico and bring them up. So it just depends on your sourcing equation. You might want to reevaluate. I think it's an opportune time to reevaluate your manufacturing and your sourcing strategies and look at the positive points of it. With that said, though, I haven't heard too many issues as far as, like you said, things are carrying on largely with the new administration. I haven't heard too much about changes. However, like there's a lot of hoopla surrounding it all. But I think if you're established already, it seems like it's going along well. Although I actually am going to do a webinar with an expert on moving things to Mexico. So I shall keep you in the loop. Now, are you hearing anything different about that?
No, the number one question or concern that I hear about Mexico is they think it's so dangerous.
Well, I do have clients that say both. Some of them are like, won't go there some executives, I should say, are very leery about going, but a lot of them just, as part of their doing business, they have no choice and they take appropriate
Exactly.
precautions.
Exactly. Don't cause overt attention to be drawn to yourself. I never wear a baseball cap anywhere else in the world. I will wear a beret or a Tilly traveler's hat. You especially in a country where they're a little bit unhappy with Americans for not Americans, but America and some
Right.
aspects of our foreign policy. There's no need to call attention to yourself. And I always
Correct.
said, learn how to, whistle or sing the Canadian national anthem because you can always pass for Canadian. Everybody likes Canadians.
Right. Right.
The reality is in Mexico, they have some real bad areas, but
Yeah.
then so do we. Would you go
Yes.
walking in South Pomona on a Saturday night?
That is true. I have heard recently that it's become like the murder capital of, I don't know. It took over #1 spot or something like that. I don't really want to know, or #2, one of the two, but either one's bad. So to your point, there are bad places everywhere. There's an area in Chicago that's really known to be horrible too. With that said, though, I think from that point of view, from a what should clients take away from this, it is prudent to be well informed about what you're doing in Mexico and make sure you're taking extra precautions and that you're being smart about it and that you go to appropriate advisors to make sure that you navigate successfully. And then within that arena, it's still, I mean, certainly from a trade agreement point of view, it's a great place to be manufacturing. And I do have clients that have facilities in Mexico and they transport materials, and they really haven't, they haven't said anything about it being an issue. To your point,
I've never encountered anything that made me feel unsafe. I take reasonable precautions.
right?
I know where to stay and where not to stay. I know where to go, where not to go, kind of thing. And if I don't know, I will ask before going. So again, sensible precautions. The experience of my clients over decades in Mexico is no one has ever had an incident. Nobody's ever had a problem. In fact, if anything, they usually are saying we always enjoy our time down there because everyone is so warm and friendly, and it's a great place to be. So
Right.
that doesn't make the news, does it?
No, that's very true. Now, I guess since we're talking about locating, sourcing, manufacturing close to customers, and a lot of my clients have customers in Canada, but also actually several of my clients are actually owned by Canadian companies, and I've and they have auxiliary facilities or whatever you want to call it here. So I think that the new agreement probably only helps that scenario. But is there anything noteworthy about Canada that we'd like to throw out as we wrap up our conversations?
Nothing that jumps out at me. The one thing to remember about Canada is despite its physical size, it's not a country with a lot of people, and most of Canada's people live within 75 miles of the US border.
Yeah.
So, it's really important to think of the interactions along this very narrow strip, and Canada has world-class everything.
Yeah.
What is the biggest untapped potential in Canada, and the Canadians are the first ones to say so, is that other than the Alberta fields for recovery of really sludgy, heavy oil, which they lack the infrastructure to get out of the country. There's just not enough to move what they're capable of producing. Canada is a great country of natural resources.
Yeah.
There is so much clean water up there, and we have drawn on some of that. There is so much potential for generating electricity through hydropower, and in Quebec that has been developed.
That's an interesting. There's some trade and partnership opportunities.
Right. Multiple places where that could be developed. And, this kind of goes full circle back to China. And China has not played the rare earth card, but 90% of the rare earths are manufactured, mined, manufactured, and exported out of China. And it's not that we don't have the ability to do it here, it's just that we haven't. And Canada is also a place where that kind of rare earth mining could take place. It'd be in remote areas. Yes, there's some environmental impact of that, but it is a big country. And there are ways of mitigating against the environmental issues of that. So,
well, that's a really good point, John, because I know that you've sufficiently terrified me in previous webinars about the fact that this has been known that there's a rare earth issue, rare materials. Is that, I don't know,
rare earths.
Rare earths. And then China could decide to turn it off, at any time, which would be an utter disaster. So we really need to do something to get a backup supply going. So do you think that's an opportunity for investors, or I don't know, private equity backers? I mean, I'm not sure, but I'm wondering how we, we could get the message out. Like basically, there does need to be a backup supply. It does sound like it crosses over not only borders, but like you said, environmental laws and other things. But I don't know. What do you think? Is it an opportunity, or what do you think what's a practical way out of that scenario?
It may not be practical, but it is necessary. We have to spend money to do it. And so given how much of this is necessary for national security, for military applications and so on, you would think the government would be spending some of our taxpayer dollars on providing that kind of secured supply, wouldn't you?
Good point. I wonder how, maybe it's getting the word out so that can be more of a popular issue.
Yeah. But then, we'd like to repair our roads and bridges that are dangerous, and we're not spending the money on that despite all the rhetoric. And so, is there an opportunity for private investment to fill in?
Yeah, that's my question.
That's really profitable. Yeah, big startup costs, but then it pays off like the Energizer Bunny.
I think by no means am I an expert in this topic, but because there's so much risk with China, to your point, it could be a very long runway. There could possibly be, but I could see it paying off significantly over time. So we'll have to see what we can do to spread the word on that as well. But it sounds like we're both in alignment that for our clients, looking at manufacturing closer to home, looking at by all means, have a backup supply. Even if you're located next to your number one customer, you really need a backup supply, because in today's business environment, there's volatility all around us. We are in a global supply chain, even if you don't have any sources of supply that are outside of the country today. Someone in your extended supply chain is outside this country, or your extended customer base. So we are a global supply chain regardless, and we need to take our thinking to the next level, I think, to future-proof our supply chain and think through these topics. But by all means, the bottom line is we need to have backups, and we need to probably readdress it. Do you have any other thoughts from your point of view? Because I know you work with, I guess at the moment we're talking about China, Asia, and likely manufacturing places, which would be like Mexico and Canada currently. Do you have any other thoughts as to what folks should be doing from a supply chain point of view?
I think the biggest thing, and you encounter it the same way I do, is that companies have to overcome inertia. And the bigger the company, the bigger the inertia, and the harder it is to move off of what they're used to and do something else, particularly if that something else requires acting with some degree of speed. So, you get comfortable with what you have, hard to overcome that. you might be alarmed by something, but oh, maybe it'll go away, or something else will come along and fix it, or
Yeah.
yeah, I need to do something about it, and I'll get to it, and you don't. It's acting. It's overcoming that resistance to act. And again, smaller companies are much more capable of acting swiftly than big companies are. I mean,
That's a really good point. So maybe what we should leave them with is why not, especially if you're a small or medium-sized company and more nimble or agile, why not consider reevaluating your manufacturing and supply chain footprint and making at least a couple of steps forward that could set you up for much more successful long term, even if it means that you're going to be investing right now in something that it might carry on just fine for 1 year, 2 years, or even 3 years. It could be carrying on just fine, but if you're willing to invest the money and take a look at this, you could be tenfold, 20-fold successful in 10 years from now. That's what I'm thinking. What do you think, John? Do you think I'm in luck here?
And of course, you have to get started with something somewhere. And so maybe the better way to start is something that's a little bit broader based, like the annual supply chain audit or review.
Exactly.
Let's take a look at your supply chain. Oh my goodness.
Exactly. Well, I mean, speaking of which, I'm working with a client right now to do a supply chain assessment. It's not focused on the sources of supply, but it's just taking a look at your complete supply chain, even internal processes. And we've identified some significant opportunities. We don't have to do them all at once. Part of the process is we say, okay, let's just take the top 3 priorities, start with number 1, and we'll knock it off. And they don't have to require, it doesn't have to be millions of dollars of investment. A lot of these small steps you can take forward can be small to even no investment, but an investment in time or partnerships or something. So I think that's a great suggestion. At least look at where you stand, because there are plenty of risks out there, and we would hate for you to be 3 years from now in the same position you are when all the risks come tumbling down and crush you. Unfortunately, it's possible and likely.
And this will sound like a commercial message, but I don't care how well-intentioned or how competent your management team in a company is, how much experience they have with supply chain and management, you need another set of eyes on it from time to time. You need an external party, an expert like yourself, who knows supply chain up, down, sideways, to say, so let's see how confident you should be in what you've got, because you get used to what you're working with every day.
The cobbler's shoes, right?
And lawyers are really better at describing. They may not be able to do anything about it, but can just identify and describe the qualitative risks that come out of the supply chain. Certainly the ones that relate to law, regulatory law, and treaties and customs and practice and so on. There's that need to constantly keep up. And I mean, if you're in exporting, and BNA ceased publication last year or about a year and a half ago, but it used to put out a weekly briefing on keeping up with regulatory law relating to exports. That weekly briefing was 40 pages long about what was coming out of our federal government.
Goodness.
And I guarantee you, that would put you to sleep if you have trouble sleeping. All you have to do is start reading it. Somebody has to read it. Somebody has to keep up. And most companies won't dedicate the human resources to doing that on an absolutely regular, consistent basis. So you need that occasional review.
Absolutely. I mean, regardless of whether you go to John and to Lisa for this review, we would highly recommend that that you start with an internal assessment and bring in some trusted advisors. It's always good to get the outside view. And what one of my clients said recently is the reason that we're bringing you in is not because we can't do this ourselves, but we want to accelerate our success, and we want to make sure that like we're bringing the latest thoughts and best practices into account, and so that we can move forward. Like I said, one way or another, with all of the risks that are out there that are continuing to increase each day as we speak, it's prudent. So we'll leave you with that thought to at least start internally and do an assessment. You don't have to go to John and I, but we're certainly options. And we have a strong team, really, of trusted advisors that we can recommend for navigating this global supply chain and all of the elements. So we're happy to pass on those referrals as well. So please feel free to get in touch, which you'll see on the slide following our webinar. So with that said, John, I would leave with a last thought of let's take a proactive approach to future-proofing your manufacturing operations and your extended supply chain, and take step one, regardless of what that step one is. I think that's what you and I both agreed should be, taking that step forward, because you really don't want to delay. The risks are definitely outweighing the benefits of standing still. And what, do you have any last thoughts to add to that, John?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, thank you very much for doing this webinar. This has become a fun series, but also, really high value for our clients and colleagues. So I want to thank you very much for doing that. And like I said, if you want to reach out to us to ask us any questions, our phone numbers and contact information will follow on the next slide. And we're happy to help. We both also put out, I have a free newsletter, or a couple of newsletters series with information, so you don't have to pay anything. And John also does some webinars and sends out some briefings from time to time. So we're both, get on our distribution list. All right. Well, thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
You too, Lisa. Thanks for having me with you again. Always a pleasure.
You're welcome. All right. Bye.